pluralism in economics, and what it means for South African academic economists. I'm in the fortunate position that I'm chairing, so I don't have to say much, except introduce my fabulous panelists. But I did bring some props. So I'll just make two opening remarks before I hand over to them. So first thing I'm going to do is do a brief introduction of the panelists. You've got their bios, so I'm literally just going to read two sentences. The first speaker is Stephanie. She's an analyst at DNA Economics, and she has an interest in economic development, public policy, and local government. She holds a business science degree from UCT, and she did a master's in economic development. Nicola is a senior researcher at the School of Economics and Business Sciences here at Wits University, and he holds a PhD from EHESS in Paris. And his research focus areas include labor markets, economic policy, and the role of the state in economic development. And then Uma is the head of economics at the School of Economics and Business Sciences at Wits. She holds a master's in development economics, an MPhil degree in applied econometrics, and a PhD in economics from the same university as Jayati, so she's our star in the session. Thanks everyone for joining us. And as I said, I just have two small things to say. When I was preparing for the session, and after a few of the discussions yesterday, I went back home and I thought, okay, if we're talking about pluralism, we're talking about different ideas, we're also talking about re-engineering economics, basically for purpose, right? So the difference we want to see in the world, or the kind of world we want to create, and also making sure that we're responding to the present challenges. And then I kind of sat back and thought, how else? You know, like, well, why else would we be doing this, and how else would we be engaging with this discipline? And I did have to acknowledge that I was in a very privileged position at undergraduate level to have incredible economics professors. So I went back to 2002 and dug out my second year microeconomics course reader. Nicola will know that I'm a big fan of David Fryer, but this was basically my textbook in second year. And he basically did this. I mean, he wrote the textbook, literally. And he did this, I think, for exactly the same reason as we're here today, because he thought that the existing books at the time didn't give us the breadth and depth of knowledge that he would want us to leave his class with. And this obviously stayed with me, and I texted a few of my friends who also went to the university, currently known as Rhodes, and all of them had kept their notes. I mean, so the impact of this kind of intervention, I think, can't be underplayed. But more than just presenting these theories, I think what it also did was it gave us a way of thinking. You know, so if you presented with someone, a lecturer who will say to you, question, you know, what is put before you, there are different perspectives, and I want you to engage with them. You carry that through your life. And so, in a less popular moment, the other thing I did in my kind of very long and eclectic career, and you can see I'm grey, so it's been quite a while, is I spent a few months at McKinsey. And so the other thing that fell out of this box of kind of goodies that I kept is the thought process in McKinsey reports and presentations. So it contains two things. It's kind of a way that you write a McKinsey presentation and the way that you solve problems. And problems, as presented in this little booklet, are kind of, it's anything. So what they give you is one single way of solving any problem that's thrown on your lap. And I think the reason I only spent a few months there was precisely because of this, you know, and the way that I was kind of taught to think and critique approaches that purport to be the way, you know, of solving problems, of viewing issues, and of resolving the issues that come before us. So these questions that you're asking, I think, are not just for now, and it's not just about different schools of thought. It's also about how you view the world and the difference you want to make, and the kind of world you want to create. And I'm sure as people sitting here, it's not just about finding a single solution to a particular problem that you can present in a very compelling PowerPoint presentation. You know, it's about constantly seeking new answers to a changing world. So that's the one part. It's about kind of, you know, not only the content, but how we think about these problems. And the other part, and I'm privileged actually that I've got two people on this panel that taught me adverts. So Uma taught me development in masters, and Nicola was my supervisor, a very long-suffering process, but he stuck with me. And I think the one thing that we need to acknowledge is that it's not just about the content that's put before us, but also the environment of learning, really. So what I did find in that process with the masters, which I mean, I don't know if I've ever said this to you, was that your sense of empathy and support, I think, was just unparalleled, right? So I couldn't have made it through that crisis of not knowing how to answer this question, whether it's the right question, and you know, all those other crises that kind of beset me, if I wasn't in a space where you were patient, supportive, critical, but also just, you know, always open to understanding that this is not just an academic process, but also a deeply kind of personal one. So yeah, so I hope that we leave here knowing that it's not just about the content, but also about the people, I think, who provide the spaces for us in which we can learn and question. Okay, so with that done, I'm going to hand over to Stephanie. She'll speak first, then Uma will come up, Nicola will close, and then we'll open up for a few questions.
Great. Okay. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to chat. I'm very excited that this discussion is finally reaching South African universities. It's been going on overseas for quite a while, so excited that we're now doing this here. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I presented similar information at another conference, but I found there that because I was going into so much depth about the background of this movement and what the problems are and what needs to be done, that I didn't have enough time to actually go into main points I want to make, which are what are the major challenges we're facing to making change, and what do the people in the positions of power, so South African academics, actually think about it. So I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. I'm going to assume that we are all, by the nature of the fact that you're here, aware of the problems with our degrees. You all have your personal gripes. You all know that economic degrees around the world look pretty much exactly the same. And you have an understanding that this is actually a global movement that has been taking place. So I'm assuming that we all agree. I hope that we can all agree that change needs to happen, but we need to come to a point of understanding exactly what that change needs to look like. Okay, so in terms of what I'm going to talk about, we want to clarify actually what change needs to take place. And I think one of the most important things that I want to impart in this talk is a criteria or framework with which we talk about pluralism. I think that it hasn't been defined, and we need to be more specific in our conversations, talking about actually what do we mean. Part of that is defining what economic pluralism is not, and also having some idea of what the end outcome would look like. And then finally, the last part will be around, South African academics are in the positions to change things, therefore we need to understand what are their concerns and how do we overcome those concerns. So first things first, yesterday in one of the talks it was mentioned that when you talk about pluralism, a red mist descends over people, and I can attest to this because I generally have found that this is actually quite a difficult, complex and nuanced problem to talk about. People have many different reactions to it, and I think that's probably because people don't know what it means. There's no common shared understanding of what is being meant by what is being said. There are different aspects to the problem, and each one has a personal understanding. So I'd like to try and give us a framework with which we can look at this problem and be quite specific about what we're talking about. I'm drawing on work by Sean Miller. He's a professor at UJ. He wrote a paper called What Does a South African Economics Degree Look Like? And I think that he gives us this very useful framework for talking about it. So he says the aspects of this pluralism debate include asking about the content of the curriculum, what's included, asking about the framing of the content, so how is the information conveyed and positioned, the contextualization of it, the relevance of it, is it relevant to those who are studying it, and the accessibility of the content. So we very briefly now apply this framework to the major arguments that students have, going through it very quickly. Looking at the first one, the framing of it, or the content, sorry. This is the topic of the fact that only one school of thought is being taught, you don't even know that there are other schools, and there's very little access to complementary subjects, philosophy, psychology, politics, all the rest. The framing of the content. So this is about how is it being taught. So what schools are being shown and how are they being positioned against one another. Why is economics being portrayed as something that's separate to politics when it's so clearly linked? Contextualization. So this is the thing that you keep hearing about maths and theories and models being taught in the abstract and not being applied to the real world and not being contextualized to the problems you see around you when the assumptions don't hold. The relevance of this, so this is this thing about economists graduate and you don't really feel any more equipped upon graduation to be able to start tackling the problems than you did when you arrived. Not being taught the relevant skills you need to actually go out into the marketplace and make a difference. And then accessibility, so this is the problem around language, quality of teaching, pedagogy, the way it's being taught, and also a lack of career guidance so that students don't graduate thinking they only have to be a consultant or a banker or etc. etc. So the point of this is to show you that there's actually a lot of related but distinct issues going on here. Each one is a debate in itself and each one merits a slightly different intervention. So we have to be quite specific when we're talking about this. Having said that, I'd like to also just clarify what, in my personal opinion, economic pluralism is not. And this talks to the very negative and strong response you get from people, which I think is largely because they don't know what this is going to look like. And there's a lot of fear around this. There's a lot of misconceptions, such as just replacing orthodox economics with heterodox altogether. That the fact that we are asking to make economics easier, to dumb it down, to take out the maths. There are those who think that actually the other schools of thought are incorrect and should not be taught. There are those who see economics as an objective science and therefore that doesn't leave place for a pluralistic discussion. And for the most part, I think people are worried about this another phrase we've heard often, the baby being thrown out with the bathwater. So it's important, if you are a proponent of this, that you clarify exactly what you are not asking for. So I personally, and I hope that people share my sentiment, are not saying that it's about less, this is about adding more. It's not about the dumbing down of economics. It's not about removing the maths. The maths is not the problem. The contextualization of the maths is perhaps something different. It's not about a complete rejection of neoclassical economics or a complete replacement with something else. That's cool. And then very quickly, I think some of the things that we should be achieving with this is the fact that students are exposed to all relevant schools of thought and have an idea of where they come from and complementary subjects. That you are actually able to critique the different schools of thought and justify your preferences, that you can actually take the economic theory you've learned in class and apply it to what you are seeing happening outside, that you can use maths. This is not about getting rid of maths, it's about actually improving your ability to engage with maths and use it to explain what you're seeing in creative manners actually, which requires you to have a better understanding of it. Better critical thinking, research data skills, and the fact that we can draw on all the social sciences to create new, unique solutions. So in my opinion, this is what we're asking for. To me, the benefits of this whole thing seemed quite obvious. So my curiosity was actually why anyone would be against this. So what are actually the concerns and some of the counter-arguments, because that's what we need to understand if we want to make change. So I conducted a survey. I want to show you the outcomes. I sent it out to 300 members or economic faculty members at 8 universities across South Africa. There was about 34 people who responded, fairly equal spread across universities, so it's not just one university that responded. And of this, 82% were senior academic staff members. So talking to the right people. So my initial question was to them, do you have any preferred school of economic thought? And actually the most common response was no. There's no preference of school of economic thought. That was followed by those who prefer institutional economics and behavioral economics. I did only have 3 respondents from neoclassical economics, which I will admit is perhaps an indication of selection bias in terms of those who were likely to answer this survey. And I would have liked to hear a little bit more from them. If you're a proponent of the mainstream, I'd like to have heard more what your objections were, but so be it, they didn't answer. So there we go. Okay, I also wanted to check if these preferences were grouped by university to see, if there's any trends there. They are not. As you can see, the behavioral, the no preference institutional did come from a range of universities, and Wits, their respondents highlighted that they have an interest in the highest number of different schools of economic thought. So no major grouping of ideology according to institution here. But despite this sort of what looks like a variation in preferences, it doesn't actually translate into what's actually being taught. Because when I asked them whether they would say that the university identifies with a particular school of thought, the majority said no, but if you add the amount who said partially and yes, that's 2/3 of the samples who said actually the university does identify with a specific school. And then it makes sense why most of them said that they gave the university a 3 out of 5 or 2 out of 5 in terms of how pluralist the university is. There's also quite clear trends around thoughts of what type of content should be taught. So in terms of, I was quite glad to see that there is appreciation for history of economic thought. Quite a few people said that should be a compulsory subject. It was also the standard appreciation or kind of emphasis of the qualitative and quantitative research methods. The second grouping is around subjects that they think should be recommended electives, and then there's quite a clear grouping at the bottom of subjects that should not be offered in economics departments. That makes sense. Those are not economic subjects. The question then is how easy is it for economics students to access those subjects? And when asked about their relations of the economics department with other social science departments, you can see a lot of them gave it a 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. So not so easy for students to get access to those other courses. In terms of whether or not they support this core, admittedly here, I suppose you could question what they interpreted economic pluralism to mean, but there's clearly quite a strong support for this from the respondents, although most of the comments were caveated around it depends how you do it. But on the whole, they seem to be supportive, and it came from across the university, so there wasn't any one particular institution that favoured it over the others. Also, I looked at whether the stance or the support was dependent on their school of preference thought. The majority of them actually, the majority of the support came from those who had no preference, which does make sense, because if you don't have a preference, you're probably more likely for a variety of schools to be taught than a specific one. But I think this is good because it means that the movement is less biased, right? It's not being pushed by one school of thought. To sum up what's on here, I asked them, well, why do you feel the way you do? Those who supported, they spoke about orthodoxy sort of inhibiting critical thought, the fact that we have a complex world, you can't have one school of thought to explain it, and that we need debate. But I think what's interesting for us to focus on is the neutral and opposition, and this is where the sort of meat of the argument comes out, where we need to engage with these concerns. So a lot of them were talking about how, how is this going to be done, that it shouldn't be done on an ideological basis, but we need to have empirical, objective discussions about how do we do this. Practical considerations around, we don't have equal airtime for all subjects, so which subjects get the airtime. That maths and modelling should not be seen as the devil and thrown out. And something else that's come up often in this conference is that students are coming in with a very poor level of basic skills. So how now are you going to move away into something more complex when they're struggling with the current basic context? Here, the major concerns or the challenges identified were the fact that there's limited time and space in the academic curriculum. If you're incorporating some subjects, does that mean it's at the cost of others, or how do you do this? That it's difficult to design a pluralist curriculum and to get it right. And the fact that the academics don't have appropriate qualifications, which is not a surprise. If you've been trained in the system we think is not correct, it's unlikely that you'll have the skills to fix that system. And for me, the biggest problem actually that any proponent of the movement, if you want to call it that, needs to overcome is the last two. The fact that academics, first of all, not everyone sees this narrow focus as a problem, and also those who do, there's conflicting opinions about what you would do with it. So that's almost maybe where you need to start. So just to expand very quickly, these are some more of the reasons as to why this is a difficult thing to bring about. Constrained environments, incentives have come up, the thing around what type of research are journals publishing, that influences your research, influences your teaching. This last one I want to emphasize, the fact that universities in South Africa tend to cater for the labour market, and we don't necessarily have a very strong appreciation of liberal education. And universities are constrained by the bottom line. They're being performed or measured according to graduate rates and throughput rates. So it's a risk for them to do this. And if they're not producing graduates that the labour market appreciates, that's a challenge for them. So just to sum up, in light of all of that, I do think that there are 3 points that I would advise economic departments to start with. They are not overall solutions, but I think it's a good place to start. I do think economic history or economic history of thought should be compulsory, so that at least when you graduate you know that there's more than one school of thought available. I do think that within the current courses, perhaps the lecturers could promote a discussion around the different schools of thought, and also that there should be some more encouragement of taking subjects from other faculties. And yeah, so ultimately my point is that economics should teach students to understand human behavior, not to just assume it. Thanks very much.
I do remember Stephanie emailing me initially as part of the survey. I just got in touch with Nicola and Gillard. And I think this is the sort of right background to get started discussions. But I want to add an additional dimension to this. And this is basically from my experience being the head of economics, and at a time where we are trying to imbibe more pluralism in the department. And I have to confess, this has been strenuous times. Okay, and I'll explain in a moment why it's strenuous times. Because although there is consensus, and as is evident from the data that Stephanie put up, that there is a need for pluralism. Okay, our idea of what pluralism should look like differs vastly between members of the staff. So pluralism, if you simply go by the word meaning, to me, in one word, to sum it up, it means inclusiveness. Okay, to include other dimensions, other schools of thought. But again, given the constraints within which we work in terms of the airtime that we are allowed to teach, and these are constraints externally provided by the Council of Higher Education. There is always then contentions for the scarce resource of airtime. Okay. So those following, let's say, the neoclassical school of thought, and those who agree that there is a need to include more heterodox thinking, would perhaps want to bias this airtime towards the neoclassical thinking. Okay. I don't think there is thorough, outright, thought of not wanting pluralism. So the contention is really about how much of pluralism, how much of heterodox is there, that mix must happen. Okay. In an ideal world, obviously, we would have sufficient time to convey all the great thinking to the students, which unfortunately we do not, and we have to have this give and take. Now, given this, the solution, what at least we have been considering at School of Economics and Business Sciences is probably undertaking some level of product differentiation. Okay, so we have a product, okay, which is our mainstream economics product, where despite what people like to believe, is not entirely devoid of pluralism, okay, especially at postgrad level. I would like to differentiate here postgrad and undergrad. Undergrad, we do have serious challenges, but I think when it comes to postgrad, honors as well as masters, we have provided some level of pluralism through electives per se. Okay, so it's not through compulsory courses, but electives, but we have made sure that one of these electives at least should be pluralism. Okay, and we call it these as writing courses. That's a way of ensuring that at least one pluralist course is being taken up through the mainstream economics. So we have political economy courses, we have institutional economics, we have development, we have history of economic thought, all of these being provided but as electives. So that's one product that we have. But of course, invite within it not just heterodox thinking in the way we consider heterodox popularly, which is devoid of maths and devoid of econometrics, but at the same time ensuring that some level of econometrics is maintained in these heterodox streams as well. So this is the way I see the future panning out of pluralism, given the constraints that we have to work under. Okay? So these are some slides that quickly put together during the lunch break. Where I like to highlight, like I said, pluralism is largely welcomed, okay, irrespective of whether we like to label oneself as neoclassical, heterodox, or whichever school of thought that we like to align with. But of course, there is tension between schools of thought when it comes to putting together these courses. And where is the source of tension? Source of tension, primarily, in my view, at least from discussions we've had this last 1 year, arose from broadly two aspects, and one relates to the rigor. Okay, so there is the notion that heterodox cannot be rigorous. Okay, and on the other extreme, you have the contention put forward that maths is really too abstract. These modeling really does not contribute. It has nothing to do with real world, and these assumptions are really taking away the purpose of modeling. Okay? And econometrics is just mumbo jumbo. Okay? So this is a real contention between, and I can identify clearly. So heterodox would believe the last two. Okay, maths is not abstract, econometrics is mumbo jumbo, and the mainstream believe that heterodox cannot be rigorous. So that's the contention basically. And then the second source of tension relates to ideology. Neoclassical is being equated with neoliberalism. Okay, neoclassical automatically means you're right wing, right? Whereas heterodox is thought to align more with leftist ideology. So this is again straight-jacketing of ideologies that is leading to the source of tension, okay, in trying to integrate these aspects. Now, in trying to include pluralism, I'll start with the undergrad. Okay, I mentioned this. It's fundamentally how much of each can you afford to provide the students? How much is possible, given the time constraint? Yeah? And of course, very important, what are the skills that we are trying to embed in students? Okay. So this is again from past presentations as well in the morning session. Of course, we are catering to varied job markets. Okay. Job markets relating to the government, job markets relating to the private sector, to non-governmental organizations. Is it really possible to have one single product that has equipped a student to cater to all of these markets? Okay, it becomes increasingly difficult. You want to give everything, a little bit of everything, and then get specialized in something. Right? So that's a difficult part, which really raises questions about the need to have really not just moderately different product differentiation, but completely different products. Okay? So what we have it with is BCom degrees, Bachelor of Commerce. I myself, I come from JNU. My degree in economics is not Bachelor of Commerce, it is BA, Bachelor of Arts. That doesn't mean that I have not done rigorous theory. I've done the theory, okay? But at the same time, I have sprinkling of sociology, political science, philosophy, and economics. Okay? And that is currently really missing from our undergraduates. I really, really feel philosophy, at least of course in philosophy, may start, in the sense, limiting ourselves to BCom degree, but trying to tinker within that. Okay? But there could be, in future time to come, larger restructuring that is warranted. So can you really have this perfect balanced program? Yeah, the answer to me, given the scale and depth and advancement of each of these schools of thought, it's really difficult to have one balanced program. Yeah? But at the same time, I would like to insist that each program needs to have sprinkling of the political thought of other streams as well. So product differentiation, so where pluralism is maintained, but inherent bias needs to be maintained. Okay, bias to one particular school of thought. So I would like to use this opportunity also to dispel the notion that there is no level of pluralism exists. The head of school came to me yesterday and said he was not happy that some speakers said there is no pluralism at present exists. At least my stance would be, the answer, is there pluralism at risk? Yes, but at postgrad level, but not at undergrad. Okay, I have to admit, at present there is no pluralism at undergrad. At postgrad level, yes, the mainstream, we provide lectures which derive from various schools of thought, providing that pluralism element. And from 2019, we are implementing under the initiative of Nicola here, the applied development economics stream, wherein the bias is towards heterodox. So you have a stream now studying bias towards heterodox, but at the same time, also imbibing, with inverted commas, the rigor of economics. Okay, so there you see the mix of mainstream and heterodox, but with heterodox as the main domain, okay, without missing out on economics and the analytical skills, which is very important. At undergrad, like I said, we have to admit there is a need for restructuring, but there is a increasing realization, and this thought has been going on for a few years, and it is with this purpose in mind that we've been planning towards adopting the core textbooks. Many of you have heard about the core textbooks. It may not be entirely pluralistic, okay, the large framework of it continues to be neoclassical, but it does provide some sprinkling of behavioral economics, some sprinkling of bounded rationality, institutional economics, etc. So students at least get a taste. But more importantly, I think it will provide more grounding and context. Yeah. Grounding and context is extremely important while teaching these abstract notions of with the theoretical paradigms. Okay? And that is where I'm sure adopting the core textbook will go a long way in providing, yes, more pluralism in teaching. And of course, at the third year level, we are now again starting in 2019 an applied development economics stream, which will give, through electives, further pluralistic experiences. Okay, so we are indeed taking cognizance of the fact that we need to be pluralistic, that is more challenging than we think, and it's not as easy to remedy, given that economics has evolved into a wide canvas where it's difficult to put everything into a particular place. So there is need for more product differentiation, which can, I hope, cut across faculties in the long run. So right now we're looking at product differentiation creating within faculties, but cutting across faculties from humanities and coming up with a common degree. I think that would add seriously new nuances to pluralism and teaching. That, I see my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's interesting sometimes how the intermediation of a public event can facilitate dialogue, I think, in a way that sometimes more closed meetings don't allow. And I feel very encouraged and look forward to the exchange with Uma after hearing her presentation. What I want to focus on today is a little bit different. I was thinking a lot about the question of the plenary, which was what should a pluralist economics look like in South Africa? And really the way I feel about it is that the question of what it should look like is, you know, I'll make some contributions, but ultimately the way it will look like is what matters, and the way it will look like will be the result of the kinds of interactions and discussions that are taking place here. I think it will be the result of hopefully a well-informed and positive exchange between academics, students, and hopefully also, if they want to be as proactive as the students, other parts of society. Workers and trade unions, for example. I'm sure if Yanni was here, he would say also employers. I think at the moment, there's a very important window of opportunity. And thank you also, Stephanie, for what you presented, which I think shows how open people can be to this. This window of opportunity to reverse what's happened to economics in the past half century, which is really a very narrowing down of the way it is taught and understood and what real economics is understood to be. That window of opportunity, we know its origins, right? It's very much the crisis. Famously, I think yesterday Tandika was reminding us of the Queen of Britain's question to a number of economists around their inability to foresee the crisis and the way in which it's thrown some of the macroeconomists in particular into disarray. But this window of opportunity has very much also been opened by the activism of students in the global north, in the global south. I think the work done by the RIFA students at BITS is absolutely amazing in calling for rethinking of how we teach and we think about economics. And of course, the activism of a number of heterodox economists whose main activity really, which is why heterodoxy always includes the orthodoxy, is to critically engage often with the dominant way of writing about economics. And by the way, I just have a small thing to mention. Some of the most active or activists of these heterodox economists, of course, are post-Keynesian colleagues who've been working in particular on financialization. And if anything, they seem to me to be very, very keen on mathematical modeling. Aside from this window of opportunity, I think there's also a challenge to have a progressive transformation of economics. I think part of the challenge is the reluctance on the part of some people, and I think you mentioned a selection bias. I think your study is probably the perfect example of a selection bias. I'm quite sure, and I think Uma was also nodding, I'm quite sure that this doesn't necessarily reflect what all the economists in the country think, what you've presented. And many, I think, are very either ideologically, personally opposed, or just simply reluctant to engage, right, and to engage with students in particular. I think part of that reluctance also stems from the consequences of what's happened to economics in the past 50 years, namely often the ignorance of the very narrow theoretical confines within which a lot of economic research is carried out. Or to borrow from somebody with whom I was having this discussion, but there's no theory in economics really, we're just looking at facts. Surely that can't be true. Any empirical analysis, of course, is derived from a theoretical understanding. Of course, it can enrich it, but it doesn't happen in the abstract. I also think, and that's the other reservation, is there can sometimes be a confusion on the level of criticism that is directed at economics. And sometimes that criticism, I think, can genuinely be unfair and upsetting for a number of people. I mean, I have myself, as a heterodox economist, often been teaching development studies students and been frustrated at the way in which complex economic realities are simplified by people who don't understand them, and then sort of the criticism that's leveraged at it shows a lack of understanding. And of course, I think the basis of critique is that you need to understand what you're critically engaging with. And that can actually reinforce the defiance that exists. So I think there are challenges, but I certainly feel as somebody who's been engaged in trying to advance pluralism or heterodoxy in economics for a number of years in South Africa, very, very uplifted by what's currently happening. And I think the student activism will be absolutely key. So in order to answer the question, and I'll move on to something else after, I think the kind of initiatives that I think have been proposed, like having curriculum reviews, right? A seriously engaged review of what is being taught with an open discussion about what could be changed, what should be kept, how to do it better, and involving various people, I think, is probably the best way to rethink this, both in terms of theoretical approaches, but also the kind of issues that I'll discuss, which I think are legitimately also something that a lot of students, certainly what's written on the board there outside, around what should economics talk about, is about. Sorry, I'm looking for page 2. Here we go. Now, what I want to emphasize in the next few minutes is why I think we really need to have pluralism in the way we teach economics. And I think what Uma said is right. WITS, I think, is far from being a worse place in terms of being closed to alternative approaches. But let's not fool ourselves that WITS is quite an outlier, right? Globally, and in particular in the most dominant part of the world, North America, economics is incredibly closed. Not just to, of course, other social sciences, but also to alternative approaches to neoclassical economics. In fact, a number of economic journals, the leading economic journals, will not publish you if you adopt a non-neoclassical framework, or even if you quote non-neoclassical papers. That's, by the way, the only reason I ever found when I thought about one paper in particular. Danny Roderick, the famous development economist, one of the world's leading economists, who's written a book to explain that he was neoclassical, that you shouldn't accuse him of not being neoclassical, which is quite interesting. We wrote a very interesting paper a few years ago called The Future of Convergence. In that paper, he explains that convergence seems to happen within the manufacturing sector. In other words, if you have more manufacturing, you have more chances of convergence, catching up with advanced countries. And he presents this as a brand new discovery. However, the entire school of thought called structuralism has, for several centuries, been making exactly that point, which is the point that different sectors have different returns to scale and have different potential for economic development. But it's very clear that Danny Roderick cannot afford to quote Nicholas Caldor or a number of other people for risk of being accused within the economics establishment of having crossed the frontier. And I think that's exactly why we need pluralism. We can't advance economic science or political economy if we don't accept a pluralist understanding of theory. This sometimes, I should add, takes very brutal forms, right? And I think you were talking, Tamara, about the ideological use of neoclassical economics. I mean, a few years ago I met an Egyptian student who had just returned from a master's degree, I must shamefully admit, at my former university in France, Sciences Po. And she was taught development economics trade economics, by a professor who showed them the neoclassical models and turned around to his developing country students and said, you see, once you go back to your country, you must show your ministers those curves and say the only thing you can do is liberalize trade unconditionally. You must remove all your trade barriers. You see, this is what's going to get your country to develop. That's the kind of brutality, I think, that hasn't been helpful, and that is often sometimes indeed related to a particular way of understanding economics. I think the best evidence, if we want to be inclusive, of why we need pluralism more explicitly, though, comes from the most interesting developments on the frontiers of neoclassical economics. And there's one particular development I happen to be very familiar with, namely that in the work of the late Douglas North and his team with Weingast and Wallace. Now, they've written a very important book called Violence and Social Order, in which they emphasize that we cannot understand rents in the classical way. We need to factor in the role of violence in explaining how societies are organized. And the role of violence in sustaining and determining the shape of elite pacts that run societies. Now, for many in economics, that's quite revolutionary compared to what precedes. For many who've perhaps read things like Barrington Moore and many other classics which are not cited, again in the work of North, Wallace and Weingast, this may seem rather obvious, right? A continuation of an existing stream of work on political economy. I happen to have discussed with the authors where this work comes from, and it comes very clearly from the fact that it's the work of Douglas North that inspired very much the post-Washington consensus, to focus on good governance as the key to development in the 1990s. However, in economic terms, what this led to was a body of work that tried to correlate econometrically the quality of institutions with levels of economic growth. Now, the way this was done was absolutely appalling. the good institutions were systematically equated with existing Anglo-American institutions, with rankings from 1 to 5. The closer they were to what existed in America, the better. Right? This one then regressed, and the results happened to be extremely, extremely dodgy, and nonetheless asserted as evidence of the quality of institutions and their role in development. And one quite important heterodox economist from SOAS, Mushtaq Khan, provided a comprehensive critique of these models and of this relationship, actually showing that something very different was happening. That critique was taken on board and very much influenced the formulation that you find in North Wallis in wine gas, because there's a very clear policy implication to saying good institutions copied on what exists in Britain and America are good for development, which is that the best development policy you can do is just to copy and paste the legal system, the property rights system, and so on and so forth. Now, this engagement with heterodox thought has led to empirical refinements, right? An improvement in the quality of the data sets that exist on institutions. It's also led to something very important, and I'm going to move to this now, which is the recognition of the need for case studies to understand the process of development, for work that actually draws on inductive approaches, not just deductive approaches, not simply trying to verify an hypothesis, but also developing hypothesis from an inductive engagement in particular with the history of a particular country. Now, I think I want to, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. I think I've pretty much covered my next point. I suppose one more thing I wanted to add, and this goes back to the question of what is covered in economics curriculum. There was an interesting debate in the 1960s linked to an economist called Dudley Sears, who questioned whether economics was really an economics for the special case, he called it. In other words, a science whose key laws had been derived from the analysis of a few countries suddenly applied to the entire rest of the world, with desperate attempts to fit that, the rest of the world, into that. And of course, I mean, Tamara would know well about this, that's what she wrote about. Labor market theory is perhaps the most interesting part of this, right? How do you apply really neoclassical labor market theory with 40% unemployment without looking at other factors? They are serious questions, right? Which don't mean that they can't be resolved. They just require, I think, much more pluralism indeed, and much more exchanges. And I think that would be part of thinking back about what people have written on these boards, right? Part of rethinking how we take certain countries or certain cases as a starting point to derive theory, as opposed to others. You may be aware that a lot of the classical macro, for example, textbooks, are simply done through, I mean, I know the case in France, what's called the Blanchard-Cohen, so the famous French economist Olivier Blanchard, who's the chief economist at the IMF, has a macroeconomics textbook. Somebody hires a few students, replaces the data of America in Blanchard's textbook with data in France or other European countries, and boom, you've got a textbook in French, right? That is very commonly what happens. And it does beg the question, are they appropriate? They might be, but I think it's a question that needs to be raised seriously. Now, what does all of this mean for pluralism? I mean, I think if we think about pluralism, I really think we're all in agreement here. And I think the definition that the international student group has put forward is actually quite compelling, right? Pluralism needs to mean pluralism in terms of theory, right? It's not about one theory at the expense of others, but it's acknowledging the existence and the long traditions associated with different theories and the contributions they can make and the differences and implications they have for how we understand the world. And in particular, in terms of how we understand collective action, right? Is everything based on individual analysis and aggregation? Is there a difference between the individual and the collective level? Do other things, such as class, for example, matter? It also needs to be a pluralism at the level of methods, and I think that's absolutely key, and I think it will require overcoming some of the tensions that Uma was referring to. I mean, Gavin Capps is in the room, and I think he's one of the best examples of something that people fail to understand often, which is that serious political economy research is, in my view, incredibly difficult to carry out. Right? If you want to study the way in which the economy works, by understanding the strategies of actors that are powerful, because then they're powerful and they shape the world, you need to have people who are likely to be resisting your research. Resisting it by trying to not give you information. Resisting it in some cases by trying to undermine you perhaps physically. resisting it by trying to undermine you, by using resources to discredit the work you have done, and a range of things like this. And there are many, many examples of that happening. And so I think the difficulty of political economy research sometimes means that people don't understand what it really means. And I think part of the challenge for us in developing a pluralist course is also going to be spelling out how we understand this methodology and how we understand its relationship with other methodologies, how we can perhaps improve it by exchanging with others and improve other methodologies, for example, more quantitative methodologies, through an engagement with qualitative work. This is exactly what Tori Bozon has written about in her address to, I think it was the Methodological Conference of South African Economists. She explains how her work on the labour market in particular has been greatly enriched by engaging with sociologists, for example. And thirdly, and I think that's a last, perhaps key point, is pluralism is also about interdisciplinarity. Right? And I think that begs an important question, right? It's what is the identity of economics in relation to other social sciences? And to which extent are other social sciences necessary for understanding the economy? Now, I think here I want to answer this with a very simple policy point, right? I think the economy, or a society like South Africa, the influence of economic policy is a far too serious matter, far too complex matter to leave to one group of people only. I think interdisciplinarity is absolutely necessary. Right? We know from the work of a number of people who worked on the history of sciences that there are two main reasons for the differentiation between sciences. One, of course, is developments within those sciences, but the second one is that people want to establish their authority as experts on particular fields. Right? And this is clear perhaps nowhere else than in economics, and in particular in the phenomenon called economics imperialism that Ben Fine has, I think, quite eloquently written about. In other words, the way in which economics has started to dominate a number of other social sciences, in particular in North America. Am I almost up? Okay. Let me just get to my very last one. Another question I think this question of interdisciplinarity begs is, and I think it kind of talks to something that's not easy for anybody to relate to, especially in the university, but is the accusation of being political. Is there something political in wanting to advance pluralism? Of course. Right? Everything is political. I would go one step further. Everything about the natural sciences is almost equally as political as it is in the social sciences. I mean, I'm at the moment reading a book by somebody I admire a lot. She's called Karen Messing. She is a Canadian ergonomist, but she started her career as a biologist. Her university had a contract with a trade union in Canada, and she was asked to try and understand the impact of ingested radioactive dust on workers. The reason why she was trying to understand this was because all of the workers she spoke to had children with major malformations. Very, very serious malformations, all of them. Yet she realized all of the research on the effect of radioactive radiation was on radiation, not on ingestion. She tried to approach a number of specialists, medical specialists, scientific specialists. All of them had the same response: I do not want to work for a trade union. And so she found herself losing a number of legal battles because across from her, some of the specialists she had approached had been hired by the employers to come and provide counter-evidence to undermine what she was saying in court. And she offers really interesting reflections on what this means. The first one, she says, the first reason of why these scientists refuse to engage with trade unions and to try and engage with understanding what seemed to her a very pressing and legitimate question was that they were afraid of being humiliated, of losing in court, because they knew very well that if you object to a multinational corporation, they will bring a battery of experts and they will outplay you in a North American court system. They were afraid for their scientific credibility. They were also afraid for their access to funding. Let's not forget the growing links between firms and research, university research, in the social, but especially, of course, in the natural sciences and in medicine, perhaps nowhere else, nowhere more than in medicine. So those people were very clearly very worried about the possibility of compromising future streams of income and of research income. And finally, and she develops this, I think, this really interesting concept that she calls the empathy gap. She says, ultimately, these are upper middle class people, these university professors. the way in which they relate to the lived realities of workers that they will probably never speak to in their lives is non-existent, right? Their problems are invisible to them. Right? And I think that question is very, very important when we think about economics that's focusing on questions of development. Right? Because I think we suffer from a very, very similar empathy gap. I mean, one of the biggest questions, that's my last point, Tamara, one of the biggest questions in all social sciences is the interaction between the micro and the macro, right? It's the subject of eternal debate in economics. And I think in the critique of the way economics is taught, I want to borrow a quote which is, believe it or not, from 1969, where the first movements to try and reform economics by somebody who became a famous Marxist economist, Ugo Radice, I'm not sure, maybe he's Italian, Radice, who wrote in a leaflet in 1969 at Cambridge University the following: "Many of us who study or teach economics feel that much of our subject matter is irrelevant and meaningless in the face of the intense social and economic problems of the world. For the most part, economics takes the existing capitalist system for granted and is concerned solely with making it work more efficiently or with making marginal adjustments which are totally inadequate. Furthermore, economists persistently deny that economic problems are inevitably social and political problems as well." Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you now. I think the way the session worked was actually quite fortuitous. I think that we did the sequence. Stephanie's framing was really good in terms of the openness I think that there is to Burns' thought. Uman took it a step further to say how this in practice is being implemented within BITS. And then Nicola, in closing, I think gave us some important principles, I think, underlying this movement, shall I say, and the importance of it, not just for us personally, but for the advancement of economic thought in general. So I'm just going to open it up, and we'll take 33 questions, and then I'm going to students.
Thank you guys so much for the session. So I'm Michelle from the US University. Having just finished my master's degree at SOAS and having been taught by Mushta and by Ben Fine, I think it's integral for us to acknowledge that this exists. A pluralistic economics curriculum does exist, and that undoubtedly there are challenges to implementing that within South Africa, and that there is no way that we can copy-paste what happens in SOAS here. But I think that when we think about the challenges of how difficult it is to provide airtime to all of these various schools of thought, that sometimes we conflate the problems to be far larger than what they actually are. I think most lecturers would admit that the overwhelming majority of the time, very little learning is happening in the classroom. But I do think that there are innovative ways for us to be able to make our students aware that here is an online resource where you can go read up about complexity economics. Here are the basic principles. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on them. And we can give students the opportunity in the areas where they're interested to go and learn further. So I think maybe we need to dispel this idea that what we're dealing with is too many things that need to be taught. I think what needs to be understood is that one of the major benefits of pluralism is that it allows you to learn a way of thinking. And that is a way to critique any methodology, any school of thought, any epistemology. So I think sometimes we allow ourselves to feel that the task at hand is such a colossal challenge, when I would argue that maybe the one thing that students are actually calling for in a pluralist curriculum is for their lecturers to teach them a way of thinking, which is a critical way. And I think we can get people, whoever it is that might be employing potential future South African economists, whether it be that you have to model something, you have to come up with a policy proposal, that what they would be asking for is your ability to know where to find information, and we can allow our students the opportunity to do that. That we would hopefully allow them to be able to think critically about whether they're modeling something or whether they're theorizing about something or whether they're providing a policy or not, and then the ability to synthesize information. And so I just sometimes think that we need to be more optimistic about the way in which we can shape a pluralistic curriculum. But then, just on a final note, which I do think is a really important challenge that we need to consider, is I think the reality of what we're asking academics to do is in a culture where you have to publish or perish. I think anyone that spoke today will acknowledge how much time it takes for you to actually try and teach in a pluralistic way. And arguably, you're unlikely to get promoted for having a really pluralistic subject, but you're much more likely to be promoted because you managed to publish in the American Economic Review. So I think, Stephanie, when we ask ourselves who were those lecturers that actually answered your survey, in all likelihood they were the ones that are passionate about teaching. But I think for a lot of academics, their major focus is research. Whether they want it to be that or not, that's the way that the incentive structure is built. And I think that that's a really serious challenge that we need to potentially start questioning. And then just to let you know that there's over 100 students from the Northwest University, and we were capped on not being allowed to bring even more than that. So just to show that there are students all over the country, not just in the major big universities, that are genuinely interested in this. And so I think that that is such a call for us to ask ourselves, not just what different school of thought we're teaching, but let's also ask ourselves, what does a specifically South African textbook look like? Or what do specifically South African journal articles look like that we can give our students to read? Thank you so much.
Okay, I think somehow I've gone ahead of some other people, so I'm sorry about that. But okay, I was closest. So thanks very much for that, and thank you, Nick, for those kind comments. I thought you were going to say I was living proof in the room that doing political economy makes you lose your hair. So that was a lot better. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to engage with you a little bit, Uma, because it's really fantastic to see the way that big efforts and discussion is going underway within SEBS to think about the curriculum and how more pluralist and relevant curriculum can be developed. And of course, you put your finger on the two big problems there as well, and we're honest about them. Number one, that this isn't happening at the undergraduate level, and number two, that even with product differentiation, as you said yourself, there's still something called the mainstream. And that I do find a little bit problematic. Because to me, you define pluralism as inclusivity, which I think is very, very nice. But I'd actually go a step further than that and actually define pluralism as democratisation, and maybe even more liberation. And the reason I say liberation isn't to get all dramatic on everybody, but it is actually to suggest that ideas, and including economic ideas, are not delinked from real power relations within the world. So what's actually taken to be the mainstream, and what is actually taken to define the discipline, is actually a particular set of ideas which have a particular set of issues, but also speak to a particular set of power relations as well. It's no coincidence that the way in which the sort of the neoliberal revolution has taken place within the North American universities and has tried to move out to colonise other social sciences and has tried to define the discipline globally with the most incredible chauvinism and violence actually towards people who don't agree with it. It's also linked with massive changes within the world economy, the rise of finance, neoliberalism as policy and so on. These things are not unconnected. So I think we have to start from the point that what is actually called the mainstream, what actually is taken to be the boundaries of the acceptable, are actually the boundaries of the unacceptable. And they're actually ideas which are being forced on us and which actually deny our own experience of where we are in South Africa or where we are as working class people. And if I can just give an anecdote to sort of finish that off and say why I think this is a universal problem. I'm quite ancient, so I went to school in Britain in the 1980s. And I chose to do economics, probably because I thought it was going to get me a job, which is why I think most people do it. And this was a really tumultuous period inside Britain. So this was like the rise of Thatcherism. I remember we'd just come through the miners' strike, which was about the smashing of the organised working class. We just had the Big Bang, which was the deregulation of the city. That happened in 1987. So this was all about the balance of class power in Britain, and it was how it was shifting. And it was reflected within the economics curriculum that we were taught. And it had absolutely nothing to do with me, and it had nothing to do with my experience. It had nothing to do with my mum and dad both having to go out to work, worrying that their wages weren't going to be enough to pay for stuff, worrying about people in the family losing their jobs, there was massive unemployment at the time, worrying about housing, worrying about food prices, the real stuff which was affecting us. The story we were being told is there's something called scarcity, and if you're not smart enough to operate in it, it's your fault. And I hated it, and I rebelled, and actually I got sung out of economics, and I'm quite proud about that. In fact, I got thrown out of college, but that's a different story. Fast forward a few years, and I somehow wangled my way to get back into university after working for a few years, and I did a course a bit more like yours, which was a BA course, which had economics in it, but also, like in our first year, what we did was we did different social sciences as well. So we did sociology, we did social history, we did philosophy, we did other things, and we did economics as part of that. And we did economic history as well, the history of economic thought. And this stuff really, really turned me on, because through these different subjects, actually there was the beginning of experiences which began to speak to me. So this is just a very personal example. And at the end of it, I came out with a first-class degree, and I never expected to end up in university. So the point is actually what we teach people, what we take to be the mainstream when we talk about pluralism. I think this is really real, because the stuff that we teach, which we say is orthodoxy, does real violence to people actually, who are from the south, or who aren't middle class, or whatever. So I think there's a fundamental imperative to actually change what we teach within the university. So it's about inclusivity, but it's about democratisation. It's actually about liberation as well, I think.
Okay, so we have 2 more hands. So I think it's time for the panelists. We'd rather take 2 more questions, and then I'll give you some time to make closing remarks. So, the lady in white. Yeah, and then at the top of the
For the presentation, I'm relatively new in this conversation. So may I please ask, to what extent has the labour market or potential employers been encouraged to participate in this debate of curriculum review, taking into account the already established debate about the mismatch between the skills produced in schools and what is required in the market, because we don't want to drift further away from that. Thank you.
Yeah, can you do this in closing?
No, I'm fine with without the mic. I'm all right. Can you all hear me well? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I put my hand off to the presenters. Well done. And I think I like it that 2 out of 3 were women. I am particularly very gender sensitive in what we do, so I put my hand off to you. But just to throw some ideas, with the first presentation, I was a bit concerned that, only certain universities, I'm not sure, or I don't know why, perhaps they were chosen. Once again, I tend to pick up that the previously disadvantaged universities were excluded purely. University of Venda, Walter Sisulu, in the Eastern Cape, Nelson Mandela, quite a lot of those disadvantaged. So I don't know how to comment. Surely there's a reason for that. But I think we should have an approach that's inclusive, because myself, I believe that it's not cremora, it's not on top, but it's inside. and also what I'm mostly interested in is, yes, South African products are being made in China currently. China is making its shweshwe, which is ideally our own, So we're not going to have decisions made by China for us in South Africa. I think South Africans, universities and academics have to get together at this moment, because, whatever text we use, we have to make sure that that text that we use, conveys what, our state of the South African society, it talks about us. We have to make sure that it is the language that is being used in a textbook, that it is used, the language that's conversant with all the students. When we know, if for instance, if you take, I'm from Nelson Mandela University, and if you take 80% of the students in the Eastern Cape come from rural areas, we have to ensure, we have a duty to ensure that the language that is used in the text is the language that is also user-friendly. So I think it's about time, perhaps, that as academics from these institutions, that we have our own endeavor and see how we take this forward.
I think I can also speak without that. Firstly, thank you so much to Stephanie and Nicholas. I think it was a very interesting talk, and I think it shed a lot of light on a lot of questions that people have been having on this issue. So, I mean, I think the first thing that I'd just like to emphasize is the importance of undergraduate curriculum being critical and being pluralist and being decolonized. Because most students don't go on to a postgraduate, right? And there's this real danger of creating this kind of idea that once you have an undergraduate degree, you understand economics, when you've only been taught in classical economics. And that is what people understand, right? If you have an undergraduate in economics, you are an economist, right? And economists have a lot of power in our society, right? There's a huge amount of power that we're given, maybe less now after the financial crisis, but we're given because we understand that our political parties are named, they have economics in their name, like the EFF, you know, the economics plays such a big role in our society that there's this huge amount of responsibility put on economists. And when people graduate, even if they get really good marks for knowing models that don't really understand our society, they have this false confidence, right? And it's like it's false consciousness. So just to emphasize the importance of us reforming that undergraduate curriculum. And then I think something that's really interesting is what Uma, you said about the job market and how if you go and work in a bank, what is expected of you as an economist is different to if you go and become a researcher, or if you go and become a policymaker, or if you go and become a trade unionist. What is expected of you is vastly different. And I'd like to propose a solution, and that's to do an employer's report. So I would like to propose that we do research into what employers want in the different sectors. So what does a unionist want out of an economist? What does a bank want out of an economist? What does what do different people want out of economists, right, in South Africa? And then make economics courses that align with those, you know. So we only have one economics course, but why not? And our economics course in Thursday has 2,000 people, right, who will go to do a number of different things, but break those 2,000 people up into 500 who will probably go into one thing, you know, and break it up like that, so that we streamline people into the careers that they'll do, and they equip them for the job that they'll do. Goldman Sachs has said recently that, no, the economists that are produced for them, and most of our curriculum is made for private sector work, the economists that they produce, Goldman Sachs has to train them for a year and a half before they can work properly in their company. So even for the private sector, you know, we're not producing economists that are critically thinking and are able to adapt. And this was their critique, is that these students aren't able to adapt and aren't critical enough for a world that's changing so fast. So that's the one suggestion on the way forward. And the other one is, as Nicholas mentioned, us doing a curriculum review and doing some research, and maybe that could be part of the conference that you're talking about.
Sorry, Mary, if I can just respond to you, because you mentioned this twice that I've been in sessions with you. My PhD is actually working on the idea of graduate employability. What do our employers want from us? However, I've got to stress that my PhD is actually focusing on a diploma level economics program. So we need to expand it, because each of our universities is actually offering a different focus in their economics. While we might have very similar first year and second years after that, Witz's courses are different to those that we offer at NMU.
Okay, thank you. So we have reached the time for the tea break, but I just want to ask for your indulgence. We can just have 2 minutes for each panelist to just make some closing remarks. I'll start with you, Stephanie. There was a specific question, I think, about the survey design and who you reached out to. But the other questions, if I can recap quickly, were about overstating the challenges, perhaps, and creating opportunities for learning outside of the classroom. And then there was a question, a comment around the boundaries of acceptability. Also, what do we mean by the conversations we are having here? Is it more than just, is it about politics and on what is acceptable, and how can we frame the mainstream, I suppose, as the boundaries of what it is we are dealing with?
That would do.
Okay, kind of. I did a disservice to your input. And then we had some inputs around the labour market. I think the third one and the fifth one, having employers be included in the debate, and also how do we prepare our students for the work that they want to do. And then the final point, in addition to the question about the survey, was about thinking about language and other elements of plurality as well when we're talking about curriculum design.
So I can't respond to all of that, but so on the point about the survey design, so it is a very relevant point. In fact, it was pointed out to me by my director both afterwards, because in fact, so where that stemmed from was I actually did a curriculum review, and then I sort of followed on the survey from the universities I had reviewed. But one of the things that actually did come out quite significantly is the difference between comprehensive universities and traditional universities. And I'm not sure about the split of the universities you mentioned and which categories they fall, but the example I can give is that actually when I looked at the curriculums of South African universities, for the most part, they were in line with global problematic trends of micro, macro, maths, modulus, but something like UJ actually has a very different economic structure of the curricula, which I found very interesting, and actually kind of going forward, I'm going to go and now look at other similar universities to see if it's just UJ or if that trend extends, because in fact, looking at the fact that our universities, most of them are similar to global trends, UJ is actually then unique in the world in the way that that curriculum is structured. So I think your point is relevant. On the NNMU, I did actually try and look, but I think I was limited by information as to what was available at the time on the curriculum structure. So I can't comment on that, but your point is valid, and I think I'm in the next stage going to go and explore a wider variety, particularly on this distinction between the two. Just kind of your point about overstating the challenges and things. So I'm not, I guess I'm maybe conservative, and I'm always kind of thinking about all the difficulties involved in things, and so your points are all very relevant. I suppose for me, at the end of the day, what I discovered going through my university curriculum and then getting into the workplace, and also 2 years later still feeling like I don't know anything and having to be trained, is just the level of how much we don't know what we don't know. So I think your point about just, even if you don't teach students in depth all this stuff, just making them aware of the landscape and that, hey, there are these other schools of thought. If you're interested, pursue your masters in it, or come and read this book or something, I think is really good, and it would help, because obviously there are students who do just want to work in a bank and they don't need to know all this stuff, but they need to still know that this exists. So I suppose for me that would be a win. If we get to a place where at least students know the structure, they know this information is out there, if they're interested, they take it with it.
I don't think that it was each question separately, but broadly classified into a couple of concerns. One, the first relating to, yes, putting too much emphasis on the aid time. I completely agree, and which is why the undergrad reform, which is being rolled out next year, includes topics on political economy. So as again, these form some of the chapters of the core economy textbook, and therein students are expected to get at least an idea that these alternate streams of thoughts exist. So the sprinkling, at least, to give a taste of what's out there. No, but I completely agree with the first speaker who highlighted the incentive structure. We have a distorted incentive structure in academics, and that is the undue weight put on research publication. That's what we thrive on, that's what our promotions exist, our probations, confirmations, and all of our basically existential issues relate to publications. So we are, of course, bounded by the paradigm in which we work, and that is to publish or perish. So teaching, really we have exceptional people like Nicola here who's putting on a lot of energy, and also within the mainstream. If I can highlight Kenneth, basic insights across various schools of thoughts. Regarding the language, our speaker from NMU, you highlighted the problem of language, and that's again something which we find highly challenging with regard to adapting core textbook. Is simply the language of the textbook. I mean, I've gone through the text, I don't teach my students, but I've gone through the textbook simply to understand, and I can imagine the response of our own students coming straight out of schooling system in South Africa and how they're going to grapple with it. So it's really the onus on us basically to move away from simply adapting a textbook, which is kind of spreading globally, but also making sure that we are able to adapt it within the South African context, make it more accessible in terms of the language. So it's a lot of hard work, and next year is going to be challenging. We are bracing ourselves for that because that's really introducing core textbook. So fingers crossed, we're trying to do our best and prepare for it as teachers. I think a lot of focus is on the teachers and lecturers themselves to prepare well so as to be able to communicate to our students where 80% of the classroom really English is not the first language. Yeah, and including the teachers. English is not my first language either. So that's going to be challenging. But yes, we are sort of preparing towards it. Yes, the undergrad curriculum, like we said, I hope these are just baby steps in product differentiation, but ultimately we would need to restructure, in my view, across faculties. Like we talk about BA, where I come from, where you come from. BA economics and think beyond BCom economics. When you say BCom, it's commerce. Yeah, it is commerce, so there is that emphasis on commerce. And within that, there is an expectation that you create in handing out a BCom degree. There is an expectation that you create and that we need to maintain. So if we have to go full-fledged into interdisciplinary, we will really have to think about restructuring across faculties. Yeah, and that's something in future we consider. But at the moment, of course, we're trying to at least tweak within what exists. Job market, I believe there's a session, I'm not quite sure, but when I went through the sessions here, there is a session where job markets and curriculum is being discussed. Yeah. It's happened. Did you attend it? Yeah. So there is need for discussion, but at the same time, I take exception to the remark about retraining being required when you go to an employer. Of course, you will need to retrain. Learning does not stop in the 3 years that you're at university. There is no way that we can stop learning and come out saying, I know everything. After all these years as an academic, I'm constantly learning and retraining every single day. I'm learning something new every single day. So learning does not stop. And there's just no way, it's a finite space, and you consider knowledge is a finite space, and that's an end all. So retraining will happen, but I always say this in the classroom, probably Tamara has heard this from me before. But what I say is, if I can walk away knowing that I've taught you how to learn by yourself or how to teach yourself, then I've done my job. That's what I hope, that can be taken away. Give direction, but also then give you the ability to pursue and learn by yourself. There's no way a teacher can teach you everything, the knowledge, because the teacher herself and himself does not know everything. I am constantly learning every single day. So, yeah, so retraining will exist, will continue to exist, and I don't think that shows the flaws of our curriculum. I do not. Yeah. Is there something probably? But yes, employer audit. I think it's a good suggestion just to know where the demand comes from, and the demands are very different. But like I said, you cannot have one single program catering to all the demand. So that's the first decision.
Thank you. Very briefly, actually, not to keep you from having some well-deserved coffee. I fully agree that critical thinking is the key. I think that's also what Mo was saying. And I just want to try and illustrate it with 3 points that were raised. The first one is the challenge of academics chasing publication numbers instead of publication quality and instead of teaching. That is a relatively recent development. Is that something that cuts in stone, or is that something that should be politically protested? Because that's not serving the greater interest of progressive higher education. The skills mismatch. Yeah, it's a big argument, especially in the business media in South Africa. Is there really a skills mismatch? Is it really what the problem is? I think we can talk more about it if you want afterwards, but there's really something behind that idea of the skills mismatch, which I think is far more problematic than a real skills mismatch that can be simply fixed by adjusting, especially academic curriculum. And thirdly, and most importantly, should we adapt economics curricula to what employers want? And do people who are going to be economists in banks not need to know some of the more critical stuff? I disagree. I think economists in banks need to know the critical stuff as much as any other economist. And I'm just going to give you a quick example from another field. I know somebody who's worked a lot on how large engineering and construction firms in South Africa have been pressurizing architecture departments to remove the critical parts of the training of architects from the curriculum. Saying, we'll give you lots of money, but what we want ultimately are people who build shopping malls and car parks and fake Tuscan housing estates. We're not interested in people who have lots of questions to ask about the role of the architect in the city and of the country and how to deal with inequality. That's not what we want. So we'll fund you if you limit all the critical parts of the architect's training. And yet architects are really important people in any society. So I would just say let's be careful about, I think it's good to know what the employers want, but we certainly also need to think critically about what the students need independently.